Okay, shop is absolutely a mess right now. Lots of projects going on, but wanted to stop and make a video because I haven't made it. Didn't make any hardly any posts last week, so time to do something for you, right? Okay, so one of the questions that I got this week was back to painting. I get questions on painting all the time. I paint with Angelus brand paints almost exclusively, and I use paint bottles and needle tips. Okay, so one of the questions that came to me was, well, what brand of paints do I use? Also, uh, how do I select which needle tip I'm going to use? The question was actually, what gauge needle tip do you use? Well, I use a variety of needle tips. Uh, One, what size of surface area am I filling in with this paint? Right here's a project that required a very small needle. I'm doing very fine detail work, very thin lines I'm trying to do. If I was, say, filling in this shamrock, I would then I would use a larger gauge needle, right? So I'm not having to work quite as hard to fill the area, and I have fewer potential streaks that would develop, and I can get that job accomplished in a little bit faster time period. Okay, so what size of surface area am I painting? What level of detail am I going after? Okay, so I use needle tips sizes at the larger end, 20 down to so far I think a 24 gauge is the smallest that I have used. And okay, so then the next factor would be the consistency of my paint. Okay, so here, for example, are two bottles of white. When I paint with this paint is about 4 years old. It's starting to thicken up inside the bottle. Not as fresh. It's still laying down well. It's not to the point where it is leaving a lot of streaks as it dries, which will happen as your paint gets older. It'll flow, you'll get it on, but it'll be kind of drying, almost setting up very quickly, and it'll leave more and more like streaky patterns in it. Very fresh paint tends to have a more fluid flowing nature, and it will flow out of the tip rather easily in most cases. So sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes a brand new paint, a fresh paint, can be so fluid that if you were to flow like this white, for example, out of a 20 gauge size, you would almost, just by inverting the bottle, start to get a little bit of a flow. Add a touch of a squeeze, and sometimes it's really easy to go from just a little bit of flow to too much flow, and it's hard to control that. So gauging down in the needle can also help you control the paint flow, which is obviously very desired. So that is another factor that helps determine what gauge needle I'm going to use. Also, just a note that metallic paints, the golds and silvers, for example, things with a sparkle or a sheen to them, those have a particle in the paint to create that effect, and that can often, if you're trying to use the smaller gauge needle, those needles will clog fairly readily. So if I'm painting with those, regardless of fresher or newer, I'll be using a larger gauge needle. Even if it's a fairly detailed area, I'll use as small as I can while still getting flow without clogging, and then and just try to be real careful about the application. So, okay, couple other tips real quick. Okay, so one of the questions I received was, what do I do about air bubbles that occur sometimes when you're painting? How to prevent them, what to do, how to know if they're coming. I wish there was a really good answer. Do this and you'll never have a paint bubble. Very much, I have not yet found the solution to preventing paint bubbles completely. However, I will tell you, one, I resist agitation of the bottle. I don't pull these out of the cupboard and go shake them up to get them fluid. If I'm going to check and make sure they feel fluid, I'll just gently kind of turn those and go, okay, yeah. But basically, I really don't even need to do that. I'll take the cap off, put the needle on that I want, I'll invert it, and then from there I use a paper towel or some kind of scrap to run a paint line, and that will tell me how fluid the paint is and what amount of pressure that I need to expect to make that paint flow. So here I'm switching to a 20 gauge. Paint had sat in this needle for a little bit, so it's kind of drying up, but I'll just gently turn it over. Okay, it's not readily dripping out of the needle without any pressure on the bottle, so that's good. So let's add a little bit of pressure and check the stream. Nice and consistent, even. Takes just a little pressure. Can flow that line. Not seeing any sputtering or any bubbles. Okay, I would say that bottle is good for use. Okay, so I'll do that before I start on a project. When I start a project, I try to, once I'm starting the paint flow, just be real consistent about it. I try not to, I don't know if you can see this, but I try not to kind of squeeze and unsqueeze and squeeze and unsqueeze. I believe that that contributes to the development of bubbles in your paint. So I try to, once I start adding pressure in a given workspace, try to keep that pressure nice and fluid, my fingers just squeezing enough and squeezing consistently, not letting up and kind of going and then squeezing again. I don't want to do anything to make this needle breathe, so to speak. So, yeah. Unfortunately, there's no guaranteed way that I have found to prevent some paint bubbles from sometimes showing up. Sometimes as you're working a project, if you're just kind of going smooth and easy, you might get a little bit of a warning by, you know, a small bubble that occurs. And you kind of go, oh, at that point, pull away from the project and run a nice line again, just like I did that other one. Run a nice long line, and if it looks good, hopefully you're okay to return to your project. Another way you can kind of minimize if a bubble does appear, and by bubble what I mean is, you know, you are laying down paint in a given area and suddenly you'll get like almost a spurt of paint. That's a little bit of a bubble that came through and, you know, spurts onto the project. Often will send paint where you don't want it. This can be various levels of problematic. Sometimes it's pretty easy to fix. Sometimes it's not easy to fix at all, and quite frustrating. But another way that you can at least minimize some damage is if I was working on a given area, say this area here, I might have my needle kind of aimed toward the center of the project and work towards the outer edges of the paint area versus having my needle pointed towards the border, where if a bubble spit across, then I would have an issue. So I might work from the inside out, more or less, try and trail along that edge in a way where if a bubble comes, it's not shooting across that border onto the other side where we don't want that paint. But bubbles are very tough, but over time, I've found that I do have fewer and fewer occurrences of that. I don't know if that's because I'm being more consistent in my squeeze pressure and just I go a little slower and take my time, or what. But okay, that's some tips for you for painting. Okay, thanks.